first time the staff at the Wildlife Rescue Center opened that door, nobody stayed long enough to get a good look at him. What they saw in those few seconds, the blur of tawny spotted fur, the white flash of teeth, the sound rising from somewhere deep and ancient inside that small body, was enough. Nobody asked what had made him this way, not yet. His name, scrawled in ballpoint on a clipboard near the enclosure door, was Flint. 42 pounds of wild bobcat, approximately 3 years old, confiscated from a roadside attraction somewhere in central Texas where he'd spent the first years of his life in conditions that nobody in that building could bring themselves to say out loud. He had arrived on a Tuesday morning in a metal transport crate that shook the entire time it sat in the back of the van. Not because the road was rough, because he never stopped moving. By Wednesday he had shredded the fleece blanket they'd placed in the corner of his enclosure. Not played with it, shredded it, methodically, completely, as if destroying something soft was the most logical thing a living creature could do. The stainless steel food bowl had been overturned so many times that the staff had switched to placing his meals on a flat rubber mat, pushed in through a narrow slot at the base of the door. Even then he dragged the food to the far corner before eating, always watching the door, always waiting for the next threat that by now he had learned was inevitable. The claw marks on the lower section of the enclosure wall were not random. They ran in parallel lines, deep and deliberate, the way an animal marks a boundary it does not believe will be respected. Above the door, a yellow warning sign had been added after the second day. Extreme caution, do not approach without protective equipment. Staff who had worked with foxes, coyotes, even juvenile mountain lions, paused their pace in the hallway outside his enclosure. They did their jobs, they kept their distance, some of them quietly rerouted through a different wing when they could. Sarah, the center's lead wildlife rehabilitator, had been doing this work for 11 years. She had helped nurse ospreys with compound fractures, black bears orphaned after highway strikes, a snapping turtle pulled from a storm drain 3 miles from the nearest body of water. She was not easily unsettled, but on her first walk past Flint's enclosure she had stopped, gone completely still, and stood there for a long moment just watching him. He was pacing, not the loose exploratory movement of an animal adjusting to a new space. This was tight, compressed, a repeated circuit of the same 4 feet of floor, turn, pace, the rhythm of something that had learned long ago there was nowhere to go but had never stopped needing to go somewhere. His ears were flat against his skull. His tail flicked in short, sharp arcs, and his eyes, pale gold with black pupils drawn to thin vertical slits, never left the door. "I've never seen an animal hate people this much," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. The center had a protocol for cases like Flint. Minimal human contact during the first 2 weeks, consistent feeding schedule, no direct eye contact during welfare checks. Let the animal set the pace. It was the right approach, built on decades of rehabilitation science, and Sarah believed in it. She had seen it work with animals far more broken than most people could imagine. She followed the protocol precisely. But she kept coming back to stand outside his enclosure, not to intervene, not to push, just to watch him pace that same tight circuit, to notice the way he always stopped, briefly, barely, in the far left corner before turning, as if something about that particular spot, some faint smell or shadow, gave him 1 fraction of a second of something other than forward motion. She started to notice other things. The way his pacing slowed slightly when the building went quiet, usually in the hour before dawn when the night staff had gone home and the day crew hadn't yet arrived. The way he would sometimes sit, not relax, but sit, facing the back wall, his sides moving with slow, deliberate breaths. The way he had begun, after the first week, to eat everything on the mat instead of leaving half of it untouched. He wasn't healing, not yet. He was still a coiled knot of muscle and weariness, and there was nothing soft or encouraging in the way he carried himself. But there was something underneath the aggression, something she had recognized before, in animals pushed far past any reasonable breaking point, that was not what it looked like. It looked like hatred. It sounded like hatred. But Sarah had been doing this long enough to know the difference between an animal that was dangerous and an animal that was simply terrified. Flint was terrified. And the thing about fear, when it has been layered in over years and packed down hard and never once met with anything safe, the thing about that kind of fear is that it doesn't disappear on its own. It waits, it hardens, it learns over time to look exactly like something else. She didn't know yet what she was going to do. She didn't even know if there was anything to be done. But she came back the next morning at 20 minutes before 6, before anyone else arrived, and she sat down on the concrete floor outside his enclosure, with her back against the wall and her hands open and still in her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't reach toward him. She just stayed. Flint paced his 4-foot circuit, turned, paced, turned. Neither of them moved toward the other, but she came back. Here is. 3 weeks in, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. One morning Sarah arrived at her usual time, sat down against the wall, and noticed that Flint had stopped pacing 2 minutes earlier than the morning before. He stood in his far corner, perfectly still, facing her direction, not lunging, not snarling, just watching. His ears were still flat. But he was watching differently, the way an animal watches something it hasn't fully decided about yet. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She let the silence do what it had slowly been doing for 3 weeks, and she went home that evening feeling, for the first time, like the distance between them had measurable edges. Then a new staff member made an honest mistake. He was young, well-meaning, covering an afternoon shift when the regular keeper called in sick. He had read the file. He knew the protocols. But when he approached Flint's enclosure to slide in the evening meal, he moved too quickly, stepped too close, and when Flint rushed the door with everything he had, the man stumbled backward and dropped the food tray with a crash that rang through the entire wing. The sound undid weeks of quiet work in under 2 seconds. For the next 4 days, Flint didn't eat. He paced continuously, the tight, relentless circuit, and the low growl that Sarah hadn't heard since the first week came back, constant and unwavering, any time a human presence registered near his space. The claw marks on the wall were fresh again. The center's director pulled Sarah aside on the 4th day and said, gently but plainly, that if there was no measurable progress within the next 10 days, they would need to talk about long-term options, a permanent sanctuary placement, managed care. A life lived entirely behind wire, never touched, never reached. Sarah nodded. She understood. She went back that evening and sat on the floor outside his enclosure in the dark, long after her shift had ended. She didn't try to undo anything. She didn't push forward. She just returned to the beginning, the stillness, the open hands, the silence, and she started again from nothing, because that was the only thing she knew how to offer him that didn't ask anything in return. Flint paced, growled once, low and warning, from the far corner. She stayed anyway. There is a particular kind of patience that has nothing to do with optimism. It doesn't believe things will work out. It simply refuses to abandon something before it's had enough time to become what it might be. Sarah had that kind of patience. She had learned it the hard way, over years, from animals exactly like this one. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Here is. It happened on a Tuesday morning, 38 days after Flint arrived. There was nothing special about that morning. No shift in weather, no change in routine. Sarah came at her usual time, sat at her usual spot on the floor, hands open in her lap the way they always were. Flint was already awake, standing near the center of the enclosure, rather than pressed against the back wall. She noticed that but said nothing. She never said much. She had learned that her voice, even soft, still registered as an intrusion he hadn't requested. She sat for 20 minutes. He moved around the space slowly, not pacing, just moving, the loose, exploratory kind of movement she had seen in flickers before but never sustained this long. At some point he stopped near the front of the enclosure, closer to the door than she had ever seen him choose to be, and he sat down. He looked at her. Not the locked, defensive stare from the early weeks. This was something different, something quieter. The pupils still narrow, the body still coiled with the readiness that had never fully left him, but he was looking at her the way an animal looks at something it has decided, after a very long time, might not be a threat. Sarah didn't move. After a moment, very slowly, she shifted her position and reached her hand toward the lower edge of the enclosure door. Not through it, not grabbing, just near, close enough that he could smell her if he chose to. She had done this once before, weeks ago, and he had rushed the door hard enough to rattle the frame. She had come back the next morning and started over. This time he didn't move. He lowered his head slightly, just slightly, and after a long suspended moment, he took 3 slow steps toward her hand. He stopped just short of contact. His nose worked in small, careful movements, reading something in the air between them that she would never fully understand. His whiskers brushed the back of her fingers. Then he was still. Sarah felt the tears before she was aware she was crying. She didn't wipe them. She didn't move her hand. She stayed exactly as she was, completely still, and let him take whatever time he needed with whatever he was deciding. He stayed close for nearly 4 minutes. Then he turned and walked unhurried to the far corner and sat facing away from her, in the particular way he did when he had decided a moment was finished. She pulled her hand back slowly, sat for a while longer, then stood, picked up her bag, and walked down the hallway without saying anything to anyone. Some things don't need to be announced, they just need to be allowed to have happened. Flint was never going to be a tame animal. Sarah knew that, and she never tried to make him one. What happened after that Tuesday morning was not a sudden opening. There was no day where he ran toward her, no moment of dramatic breakthrough that erased everything that had been done to him before he arrived. Healing for an animal like Flint didn't work that way. It worked the way water works on stone, slowly, invisibly, until one day the shape of something has changed and you can't point to the moment it happened. He began allowing her closer. Not always, not on demand, on his terms, in his time, which was the only way it was ever going to mean anything. Some mornings he met her near the door. Some mornings he stayed at the far wall and watched her from a distance, and she accepted that just as easily, because accepting it was the whole point. He was learning, for what may have been the first time in his life, that a human presence in his space did not automatically mean something would be taken from him. The pacing stopped. Not all at once, but gradually, over the weeks that followed, until one morning Sarah realized she hadn't seen him pace in over 2 weeks. He slept in full view now, stretched out on the raised platform the staff had added to his enclosure, in the loose, unguarded way that animals only sleep when some part of them believes, however quietly, that they are safe. The director passed her in the hallway one afternoon and said simply, "He's a different animal." Sarah nodded. She knew that wasn't entirely true. He was the same animal. He had always been this animal, the one capable of stillness, of curiosity, of choosing proximity over distance. That animal had been there the entire time, underneath everything that had been layered over it. All that had changed was that he had finally been given enough consistent safety to let it show. He would live at the center permanently. His history made release impossible, and he would never be handleable in any conventional sense. There would be new staff who would need to learn his boundaries, mornings when the old weariness surfaced and reminded everyone of where he came from. That was the honest version of this story, and Sarah had made peace with it. But there were also mornings, still and quiet, before the rest of the building came alive, when she sat near his enclosure and he came and settled close to the other side of the wall, near enough that she could hear him breathing, and neither of them needed anything from the other except exactly that. 42 pounds of survival, slowly learning what it felt like to rest. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.